the man who won his freedom and then changed the law, the story that shouldn't exist. History is comfortable when it fits a clean narrative. Slavery begins. Oppression continues. Resistance rises. Freedom eventually comes. That arc is familiar, predictable, morally ordered. But sometimes history refuses to behave. Sometimes it produces a story so complicated, so uncomfortable, that it unsettles every easy conclusion. In 1655, in colonial Virginia, a black man went to court and won, not to fight for his own freedom. He already had that, not to challenge slavery, not to abolish it. He went to court to argue that another black man belonged to him permanently, and the court agreed. The man's name was Anthony Johnson. He was born in Angola around the early 1600s. He survived the Atlantic crossing. He survived the early chaos of Jamestown. He survived indentured servitude. He survived disease and massacre. He gained freedom. He acquired land. He raised cattle. He built a family. He became a landowner in Virginia, a black landowner in the 1600s. And then, in 1655, he filed a lawsuit against a white neighbor over the labor of a black man named John Casor. The court ruled in Johnson's favor. John Casor was declared Johnson's servant for life. That ruling is one of the earliest documented civil cases in colonial America where a black man successfully argued in court for lifetime control over another black man's labor. This is not the story most people expect. This is not the story that fits neatly into moral binaries. This is the story of a man who survived slavery and then stood inside the system that would soon harden into racial caste. Anthony Johnson forces us to confront something unsettling. Early colonial America was more fluid than we imagine, until it wasn't. And in that transition, from fluidity to permanence, his life sits at the center. Befren race became law. When Anthony Johnson arrived in Virginia in the 1620s, the system was not yet fully racialized. Africans were brought in increasing numbers, yes, but the legal distinctions that would later define blackness as permanent enslavement had not fully crystallized. Many Africans in early Virginia were treated as indentured servants, meaning they served for a term of years. Conditions were brutal, survival rates were low, but completion of service sometimes resulted in freedom, land grants, and even legal standing. Johnson himself appears in records first as Antonio, a servant owned by a planter named Edward Bennett. During a violent conflict between English settlers and Native American tribes in 1622, many colonists were killed. Johnson survived. Survival mattered in Virginia. Those who endured disease, famine, and attack accumulated value. After serving his term, Johnson gained his freedom. He married a woman named Mary, also African, who had likewise completed her indenture. Together they acquired approximately 250 acres of land on Virginia's eastern shore. This is the part of the story rarely emphasized. Anthony Johnson was not powerless. He was not perpetually enslaved. He navigated the early colonial system successfully, and in doing so, he reveals something critical. The early decades of Virginia were unstable and not yet rigidly racial. But that instability would not last. The lawsuit that changed everything. In 1655, Johnson went to court over a dispute involving John Casor, a black man who had been working on Johnson's land. Casor claimed he had completed his term of service and should be free. A white planter, Robert Parker, supported Casor's claim and allowed him to work on his own land. Johnson disagreed. He argued that Casor was his servant for life. The Northampton County Court initially sided against Johnson, but he persisted. He appealed, and in a reversal, the court ruled that Casor was indeed Johnson's servant for life and must be returned. The court ordered Parker to pay damages. Because it shows that in 1655, a free black man could own land, hire lawyers, sue a white man, win, and have the court enforce his claim. That degree of legal standing would not last long, but it existed, briefly, and in that brief window, Anthony Johnson operated fully within colonial law. What this means, this case complicates every simplified narrative. It demonstrates that early Virginia did not immediately operate under fully codified racial slavery. It shows Africans could gain freedom, accumulate property, and access courts. But it also reveals something else. The legal concept of lifetime servitude was emerging. Johnson's victory did not invent slavery, but it reinforced the idea that lifetime labor control, even outside strictly racial terms, was legally enforceable. Within decades, Virginia would codify permanent racial slavery in statute. The 1662 law declaring children follow the status of the mother, the 1705 slave codes, the legal insulation of whiteness. Anthony Johnson's lawsuit exists at the pivot point between flexibility and fixation. He stood in the system just before it hardened irreversibly. The shift after Jamison. By the late 1600s, the window that allowed black land ownership narrowed dramatically. Laws increasingly restricted property rights for Africans and their descendants. After Johnson's death, his land was subject to legal challenge. A court declared that because he was a Negro, and by consequence an alien, his land could revert to the crown. This language marks the transition. Where earlier courts recognized Johnson's standing, later courts stripped it. The system was changing. Fluidity was closing. Race was hardening. The question that lingers, was Anthony Johnson an oppressor, a survivor, a participant, a victim of larger forces? The answer is not simple. He was a man navigating the only system available to him. He sought security in a colony defined by instability. He used law because law was the tool available. But the law he used would soon turn against people like him. That is the tragedy of transitional figures. They survive in one era only to see its closure in the next. Why this story matters. Anthony Johnson's life reveals that racial slavery in America was constructed, not inevitable. There was a time when Africans gained freedom in Virginia. There was a time when they owned land. There was a time when they could sue in court and win. Then the system changed, and understanding how it changed matters. Because systems are built step by step, and what is built can be studied, and what is studied can be understood. Or Mangala to Virginia, survival before Sturcher. Long before the name Anthony Johnson appeared in a Virginia court record, before the lawsuit, before land ownership, before legal precedent, there was another name, Antonio, and before that, likely a name that colonial records never preserved. He was born in the early 1600s in the region of Angola in West Central Africa, an area deeply entangled in the expanding Portuguese slave trade. At that time, Angola was not an isolated land. It was a battleground of kingdoms, trade networks, warfare, and European influence. The kingdom of Ndongo and surrounding polities were under increasing pressure from Portuguese expansion and internal conflicts. Captivity in this context often came through warfare or forced tribute, feeding a transatlantic system that was growing rapidly in demand. Antonio was captured and placed into that system. The Middle Passage, the forced Atlantic crossing, was not a single uniform experience, but the conditions were consistently devastating. Ships were overcrowded, disease was rampant, mortality was high. Survivors did not arrive whole. They arrived reshaped by trauma, by dislocation, by the collapse of their prior world. Yet survival itself became the first act of resistance. Antonio survived. He was transported to Virginia sometime around the early 1620s, likely arriving during the fragile early years of the English colony at Jamestown. Virginia was not yet a stable plantation society. It was struggling to survive. Tobacco was becoming profitable, but disease killed settlers at extraordinary rates. Food shortages were common. Indigenous resistance was ongoing. In 1622, a coordinated attack by Native American groups killed hundreds of colonists. The colony teetered on the edge of collapse. Antonio survived that too. Records indicate that he was owned by Edward Bennett, a planter on Virginia's eastern shore. At that stage, Africans in Virginia occupied an ambiguous legal space. They were certainly unfree, but the legal category of racial hereditary slavery had not yet hardened into statute. Many Africans were treated similarly to European indentured servants, required to serve for a term of years, after which freedom could be granted. Conditions were harsh for all laborers. Mortality did not discriminate neatly by race in those early decades. Disease and malnutrition cut across categories. Antonio endured his term, and when that term ended, he gained his freedom. That fact alone destabilizes modern assumptions about early colonial slavery. Freedom for Africans in the 1620s and 1630s was possible. Not common, not easy, but possible. Antonio took the English name Anthony Johnson. He married Mary, an African woman who had likewise gained her freedom. Together they built something extraordinary: stability. By the 1640s, Johnson had acquired land, approximately 250 acres. He cultivated tobacco. He raised livestock. He brought laborers to work his fields. His household appears in tax rolls and land patents. He operated within the same legal structures as white planters. In court documents, he is addressed as Mr. Anthony Johnson, a title of respect. This period represents a fleeting moment in American history when racial lines had not yet fully calcified into permanent caste. Africans could, under certain conditions, enter the category of free landowners. Johnson was not alone. Other Africans also gained property and legal recognition, but the system around him was shifting. The demand for labor intensified. Tobacco profits grew. Wealth concentrated. Elite planters began seeking more predictable and permanent control over labor. Temporary indenture created instability. Freed servants, whether African or European, competed for land. Class tensions simmered, and within this unstable environment, legal distinctions began sharpening. Johnson stood at the edge of that transformation. His life spans two worlds, one of limited but real mobility, and another soon to become rigidly racial. By the early 1650s, the colony's leadership was increasingly codifying differences. Religious identity, Christian versus non-Christian, initially shaped distinctions. But baptism began losing its power as determinative status. Race slowly replaced religion as a dividing principle. The lawsuit Johnson would file in 1655 did not occur in a vacuum. It occurred in a colony experimenting with permanence. He had survived capture. He had survived the Atlantic. He had survived colonial chaos. He had secured land and legal standing, but he was living in a society about to redefine what blackness meant under the law. And that redefinition would change everything. The 1655 courtroom, when a black man won, and historied. The year is 1655. Virginia is no longer a fragile outpost on the brink of collapse, but it is still unstable. Tobacco has made fortunes possible. Land hunger is growing. Labor demand is intensifying. The legal system is maturing, slowly, unevenly, but it is taking shape. And inside Northampton County Court, a case is unfolding that will quietly mark one of the most important transitions in early American labor law. At the center of it stands Anthony Johnson, no longer Antonio the indentured servant, but a landowning free black planter. Opposing him, indirectly, is a white neighbor named Robert Parker, and between them is a black man named John Casor. Casor claimed that he had completed his term of service under Johnson and was therefore free. Parker supported that claim, allowing Casor to work on his own plantation. Johnson insisted that Casor was not a term-bound servant, but his servant for life. This distinction was critical. In early colonial Virginia, many laborers served fixed terms, 7 years, 10 years. Afterward, they could potentially claim freedom. But lifetime servitude, permanent bondage, was not yet universally codified for Africans. It existed in practice in some cases, but it was not fully hardened into statute. Johnson's argument was bold. He claimed legal ownership not of years, but of a life. The court initially ruled against him. Casor appeared to have a legitimate claim to completed service, but Johnson did not withdraw. He pursued the matter. He appealed, and in a reversal, the Northampton County Court ruled in Johnson's favor. The judgment declared that John Casor was indeed Anthony Johnson's servant for life and ordered Parker to return him and pay damages. Pause there. In 1655, a free black man sued a white man in colonial Virginia and won. The court enforced his property claim. The court recognized his standing. The court treated him as a legal actor within the same system governing white landowners. That alone reveals how fluid the colony still was. But the deeper significance lies elsewhere. The court validated lifetime servitude through a civil ruling. It did not create racial slavery in that moment, but it reinforced the legality of permanent labor control. And this happened only 15 years after the lifetime sentence imposed on John Punch, the 1640 ruling that differentiated punishment by race. Together, these cases form bookends of transition. Punch's case showed that African labor could be permanently extended as punishment. Johnson's case showed that permanent servitude could be defended and enforced as civil property claim. Punitive permanence, economic permanence. The architecture was forming. The irony at the center, Anthony Johnson was not inventing slavery. He was operating within the available legal framework to protect what he saw as his property interest. In a precarious colonial world, land and labor meant survival. Johnson had built his life from near total dispossession. Security required control, but here lies the paradox. A man who survived the early system of indenture was now participating in the transition toward lifelong servitude. Was Johnson morally responsible for what the system would become? That is too simple a framing. He was navigating a shifting structure. He used law as law was available. He sought economic stability in a colony that rewarded control. Yet the legal reasoning that supported his claim would soon be weaponized in a more rigid racial direction, one that would eliminate the flexibility that had once allowed him to rise. The Kurtz logic. Why did the court reverse its decision? Archival records suggest that Johnson was able to present testimony that Casor had acknowledged lifetime obligation. The court appears to have accepted this framing. There is no explicit racial theory embedded in the ruling. It reads as civil property dispute resolution, but the implications were broader. The court affirmed that lifetime servitude was enforceable through civil law. This mattered enormously, because civil law, property law, becomes more durable than criminal punishment. It defines inheritance, wealth transfer, and generational stability. Once lifetime labor could be validated in property disputes, it could be normalized economically. The window closing in the years following Johnson's case, Virginia's laws increasingly hardened racial distinctions. In 1662, the colony passed the statute, declaring that children would inherit the status of their mother. This ensured hereditary slavery. In 1667, baptism was declared irrelevant to enslaved status. By the early 1700s, the 1705 slave codes would fully codify racial slavery as permanent and hereditary. And here is where Johnson's story becomes tragic. After his death, his land became vulnerable. A later court declared that because he was a Negro and by consequence an alien, his land could revert to the crown. The same legal system that once recognized his standing now stripped it. The fluidity that allowed Johnson to rise was evaporating. Race was replacing flexibility. A transitional figure, Anthony Johnson represents a transitional era, a brief window in colonial America when racial categories had not yet fully calcified. He navigated that window successfully, but he did so at the edge of transformation. He lived between two systems, one where African servitude could end, one where African servitude would become permanent. His lawsuit sits at the pivot. He did not foresee the full implications. But history, looking backward, can see them clearly. The Depere question. Was Johnson's case a catalyst or a symptom? Did his victory accelerate legal permanence, or did it simply reflect trends already underway? Most historians agree it was symptomatic. Economic forces were pushing Virginia toward permanent labor control regardless. But Johnson's case demonstrates that lifetime servitude could be argued successfully in court, not just imposed through punishment. It legitimized permanence through civil precedent, and precedent accumulates. 1662, when race became inheritable. If the 1655 courtroom victory of Anthony Johnson represented a world still flexible, still negotiating categories, the year 1662 represents the moment that flexibility began to close. It did not close with spectacle. There was no dramatic proclamation, no trumpet blast, just a statute passed by the Virginia Assembly. Brief in wording, enormous in consequence. The law declared that children born in Virginia would inherit the status of their mother. That single sentence altered the future of an entire continent. Under English common law, status typically followed the father. Property, lineage, legitimacy. These flowed through male lines. Virginia's legislators made a deliberate departure. They created a new rule specific to the colony's labor system. Why? Because the economics demanded it. By the early 1660s, tobacco cultivation was deeply entrenched. Plantation owners required long-term, stable labor. Importing Africans was expensive and unpredictable. Disease still threatened populations, but reproduction was controllable, if law permitted it, by ensuring that children born to enslaved women were automatically enslaved. Lawmakers guaranteed generational continuity of labor. Enslaved women were no longer merely workers. They became economic multipliers. This was not biological inevitability. It was legal design. And that design hardened what had once been negotiable, the shift from possibility to permanence. Before 1662, there were documented cases of Africans completing terms of service and becoming free. Anthony Johnson himself stood as proof of that possibility, but after 1662, the pathway narrowed drastically. If a woman was enslaved, her children would be enslaved, regardless of the father's identity. This meant that even if a white planter fathered a child with an enslaved woman, the child remained property. The law protected wealth accumulation. It protected plantation continuity. It protected racial hierarchy. It eliminated ambiguity. This statute did not invent slavery. It made slavery self-reproducing, and that difference is critical. The indentured economics of bondage. The 1662 law reveals something uncomfortable but historically vital. Colonial slavery was not just racialized. It was gendered. Enslaved women occupied a dual role, laborers in fields and bearers of future labor. The economic incentive to control their bodies intensified. Reproduction became directly tied to asset growth. Probate inventories from the late 1600s increasingly list enslaved women alongside children. Estate appraisals assign value to family units. Records describe woman and child as part of inherited property. The system now sustained itself internally. The demographic implications were enormous. By the early 18th century, Virginia's enslaved population was growing through birth as much as through importation. The legal choice made in 1662 allowed slavery to become generational, and once generational, it became normalized. Children born into bondage did not witness its creation. They inherited its inevitability, Bacon's rebellion, and racial hardening. In 1676, a crisis accelerated everything. Bacon's rebellion erupted as frontier settlers, frustrated by land scarcity and political exclusion, challenged colonial authority. What made the rebellion particularly alarming to elite planters was its cross-racial composition. Poor European settlers and African laborers found common cause against the colonial governor. That alliance terrified the ruling class. If class solidarity transcended race, elite control could collapse. The solution was not reform. The solution was division. After Bacon's rebellion, Virginia lawmakers intensified racial distinctions. Laws increasingly privileged Europeans, even poor Europeans, over Africans. Whiteness became shield. Blackness became confinement. The legal framework expanded. Restrictions on interracial marriage. Prohibitions on black testimony against whites. Limitations on movement. Harsher punishments for insurrection. The fluidity that once allowed Anthony Johnson to rise was closing permanently. Race was no longer descriptive, it was definitive. The Treaty of Transocean. Anthony Johnson lived at the edge of this transformation. He gained land in a colony still experimenting with categories. He won a lawsuit in a court that still recognized his standing. But the system was evolving around him. After his death in the 1670s, the same legal environment that once empowered him reclassified him. A court declared that because he was a Negro, and by consequence an alien, his land could revert to the crown. That language reveals the shift. Black land ownership was becoming suspect. Alienage was being attached to African identity. The law was narrowing the category of belonging. Johnson's life illustrates the brief possibility before permanence and the rapid closure that followed. Structure over individual. It is tempting to interpret Johnson's story through moral lens, to praise or condemn. But the deeper lesson is structural. He navigated the rules available to him. He sought stability in an unstable colony. He used courts because courts were accessible, briefly. But individuals do not control systemic evolution. Economic forces, political fear, and social engineering reshaped Virginia's labor system. The 1662 statute ensured generational bondage. Bacon's rebellion ensured racial division. Subsequent codes ensured enforcement. Together, they transformed colonial Virginia from flexible labor society into racial caste system. And Anthony Johnson stands at the pivot, 1705, when flexibility did. By the time the Virginia Assembly passed the comprehensive slave codes in 1705, the experiment was over. The ambiguity that had defined the early decades of colonial labor had vanished. The window that allowed men like Anthony Johnson to gain land, marry freely, sue in court, and win, had closed. What replaced it was not chaos. It was structure. And structure, once formalized, is far harder to dismantle than custom. The 1705 slave codes did not introduce racial slavery. They consolidated it. They gathered decades of scattered statutes and judicial practices and fused them into one coherent legal architecture. Africans and their descendants were explicitly defined as real property. Baptism no longer mattered. Christian conversion did not change status. Freedom was no longer ambiguous or negotiable. It was exceptional and increasingly rare. The language of the code is chilling in its calm precision. Enslaved people were described in the same categories as livestock and tools. Movement required written permission. Physical resistance justified lethal force without penalty. Enslaved individuals could not testify against white colonists in court. Marriage between races was prohibited. Armed patrol systems were formalized to control mobility. The colony was no longer experimenting, it was enforcing. The shift from term-based servitude to lifetime hereditary bondage was now total, and in that totality, Anthony Johnson's earlier world feels almost impossible. The economic lock-in. By 1705, tobacco had made Virginia wealthy. Plantations expanded. International markets depended on colonial output. Investors demanded stability. Stability required predictability. Predictability required permanence, lifetime. Hereditary slavery offered precisely that. The enslaved population began growing not only through transatlantic importation, but through birth. The 1662 statute, ensuring that children inherited the mother's status, turned reproduction into a financial asset. Plantation inventories from the early 18th century increasingly listed family groups as capital holdings: Negro woman and 2 children, boy aged 8, girl aged 3. Each line item represented not just labor, but future labor. The legal system had successfully fused race, property, and generational wealth. The transformation was complete. What happened to Joseph's legacy? After Anthony Johnson's death in the 1670s, his land was challenged. A Virginia court declared that because he was a Negro and by consequence an alien, his property could revert to the crown. The same legal structure that once recognized him now reclassified him. That phrase, alien, reveals how racial identity was shifting from fluid category to permanent exclusion. Blackness was no longer merely descriptive. It was disqualifying. Johnson's descendants fade from the record after this period, not because they vanished, but because the legal protections that once acknowledged them dissolved. The system no longer permitted upward mobility through law. The door had shut, from local practice to cultural assumption. Once the 1705 codes took effect, a new generation grew up knowing only one structure: racial hierarchy embedded in law. Children born after 1705 did not witness the earlier flexibility. They inherited permanence as norm. And when something is inherited as normal, it becomes invisible. The colony's white population internalized racial superiority as legal fact. Even poor Europeans, who still struggled economically, possessed status above enslaved Africans. Whiteness became social currency. It bound together classes that might otherwise have fractured. The ruling elite had solved the problem exposed during Bacon's Rebellion. Racial division replaced class solidarity. Anthony Johnson had once stood inside a fluid hierarchy. That hierarchy was now sealed. The Atlantic expansion. As Virginia codified slavery, the Atlantic world intensified its trade. British ships carried captives from West Africa in increasing numbers. Insurance policies covered slave cargo. Ports thrived. The Middle Passage became routine. But here is the distinction. Virginia's system was no longer dependent solely on imports. It had engineered self-sustaining bondage. This made the colony's slave society uniquely durable. Even if transatlantic supply fluctuated, hereditary law ensured continuity. The permanence first hinted at in the 1655 lawsuit had become institutional bedrock. The philosophical controlled edition. By the mid-1700s, Enlightenment ideals began circulating through colonial elites. Discussions of liberty, representation, natural rights, and social contracts intensified. Yet these ideas coexisted with the fully codified slave system. The contradiction did not immediately destabilize society. Instead, intellectual justifications emerged. Some argued that Africans were inherently inferior. Others claimed economic necessity. Some compartmentalized moral discomfort. Law remained unchanged. The structure was too profitable, too entrenched, too normalized. Anthony Johnson's era of fluid categories had become distant memory. The long arc forward. By the time of the American Revolution, slavery was not a marginal practice. It was foundational to colonial wealth. The Declaration of Independence would proclaim universal equality, but the Constitution would protect slavery through compromise. The nation inherited a system already hardened. The roots of that hardness stretched through to 1705 codes, through the 1662 hereditary statute, through the courtroom ruling of 1655, back to the early differentiation seen in cases like John Punch. Anthony Johnson's life occupies the transitional space between possibility and permanence. He did not design the system. He did not foresee its trajectory. But he lived at its pivot, and that pivot reshaped a continent. Wimpopulation Beckham pair. By the early 1700s, Virginia was no longer improvising. The slave codes had hardened. The hereditary principle was secure. The courts no longer experimented with ambiguity. And the most telling transformation was not merely legal, it was demographic. In the early 1600s, Africans were a small minority in Virginia. Mortality was high. The colony was fragile. But after the 1662 hereditary statute and the consolidation of slave codes, the enslaved population began expanding rapidly, not just through transatlantic importation, but through birth. This shift is critical. When a labor system reproduces internally, it no longer depends entirely on outside supply. It becomes self-sustaining. Estate records from the 18th century show growing enslaved family units. Plantation inventories list mothers, sons, daughters, multiple generations. The colony's wealth was no longer tied only to imported labor. It was tied to controlled reproduction. This demographic transformation locked slavery into the economic bloodstream of Virginia. And once labor became population-wide, resistance became riskier, suppression became more organized, and hierarchy became more visible. Anthony Johnson's early world, where Africans could occasionally transition into landowners, was statistically overwhelmed by a new reality. By the mid-1700s, Black Virginians were overwhelmingly enslaved. The creation of a plantation elite. As tobacco wealth accumulated, a planter aristocracy emerged. Families consolidated power, land holdings expanded, political office concentrated within a relatively small elite network. The plantation was not just a farm, it was an economic engine, a political base, a social hierarchy, and enslaved labor stood at its center. The planter class depended on predictability, and predictability required rigid racial order. Legal codes ensured that white status meant citizenship. property rights, and political voice. Black status meant labor, surveillance, and legal restriction. The system was now complete enough that it no longer required frequent adjustment. It required maintenance. Anthony Johnson had once been addressed in records as Mr. Johnson. That honorific would not easily attach to black landowners in the hardened 18th century. The narrowing of possibility was visible in language itself. Whiteness became normalized authority. Blackness became normalized subordination. And the psychological dimension deepened. The social construction of fitness. One of the most profound developments in 18th century Virginia was the stabilization of white as a legal and social identity. Early in the colony's history, Europeans were differentiated by nationality: English, Irish, Scottish, German. But as racial slavery hardened, these distinctions softened under the umbrella of whiteness. Whiteness became the unifying category. Even poor Europeans, who owned no land and struggled economically, were granted legal superiority over enslaved Africans. They could testify in court. They could bear arms. They could not be enslaved permanently. This dynamic prevented cross-racial class alliances, the very fear that had emerged during Bacon's rebellion. Status replaced solidarity. The planter elite did not need to eliminate class inequality entirely. They needed only to ensure that racial hierarchy overrode it. And it worked. By the mid-1700s, whiteness was not merely descriptive. It was political insulation, the ideological defense of slavery. As the Enlightenment spread through the Atlantic world, colonists began speaking more openly about liberty, natural rights, and representative government. Philosophers debated equality and governance. Newspapers circulated political essays. Yet within Virginia, the slave system expanded. This contradiction required justification. Writers and thinkers began developing arguments about racial difference. Some framed Africans as naturally suited for labor. Others claimed biblical sanction. Still others emphasized economic necessity. These rationalizations did not precede the system. They followed it. The structure demanded explanation. So explanation was crafted. Anthony Johnson's world had not yet required such elaborate ideology. His era was transitional. By the 18th century, ideology hardened alongside law. The expansion beyond Virginia's system did not remain confined to its borders. Neighboring colonies adopted similar codes. The Carolinas developed rice and indigo plantations with heavily enslaved labor forces. Georgia eventually followed. By the time of the American Revolution, slavery was deeply embedded across the southern colonies. The Atlantic trade intensified. Ships departed from African coasts in increasing numbers. Insurance markets expanded around slave cargo. British imperial commerce intertwined with colonial plantation wealth. The local experiment had become imperial system, and yet, even within that system, traces of the earlier flexibility lingered in memory, if not in law. The fact that Anthony Johnson had once owned land and won a lawsuit demonstrates that racial caste was constructed over time, and that construction can be traced. The age of revolution. By the 1760s and 1770s, political tension between colonies and Britain intensified. Taxation disputes escalated. Colonial leaders spoke of tyranny. Pamphlets invoked liberty, but enslaved populations heard those words too. The contradiction sharpened. How could a society demand freedom from imperial control while maintaining hereditary racial bondage at home? The Revolutionary War would not immediately dismantle slavery. In fact, in the South, it would largely preserve it. But the language of liberty introduced moral friction that would grow over decades. Anthony Johnson did not live to see the revolution. But the system that closed the door behind him would now be forced to defend itself against its own rhetoric. A structure so normal it became invisible. By the time the United States was formed, slavery was not new. It was ordinary. It was external. It was legally protected in compromise clauses within the Constitution. And when something becomes ordinary, it becomes difficult to imagine alternatives. That is the ultimate power of gradual construction. The system did not announce itself as permanent at its beginning. It grew permanent through repetition. Anthony Johnson's lifetime sits at the hinge between two Americas, one where race had not yet fully determined destiny, and one where it almost entirely did. The revolutionary paradox. By the time the American Revolution erupted in the 1770s, the world that had once allowed Anthony Johnson to rise had long disappeared. The flexibility of early Virginia was a memory buried under statutes, patrol systems, and hereditary bondage. Slavery was no longer experimental. It was embedded, and yet, the language that ignited the revolution threatened to destabilize it. Colonial leaders began speaking openly of natural rights, consent of the governed, liberty and tyranny. Pamphlets circulated arguing that no people should be subjected to rule without representation. The rhetoric was powerful, electrifying. But there was a contradiction at the center of it, because the same colonies demanding freedom for Britain had built an economy on permanent racial servitude. The irony was not subtle, it was structural. When the Declaration of Independence proclaimed that all men are created equal, it was written in a society where thousands of men, women, and children were legally defined as property. This contradiction did not surprise enslaved people. It forced white colonists into uneasy negotiation. The where and the promise of freedom. The Revolutionary War created opportunity and instability. Both the British and the Continental forces offered freedom to enslaved people who would fight on their side. Thousands took the risk. For many enslaved Africans in America, the war was not abstract political philosophy. It was a possible doorway to liberation. Yet in the southern colonies, slaveholding elites were unwilling to dismantle the system that underpinned their wealth. The revolution secured independence from Britain, but it did not secure universal emancipation. Some northern states began gradual abolition, but in the South, slavery expanded westward with the growth of cotton agriculture in the late 18th century. The revolution resolved colonial governance. It did not resolve racial bondage. The system constructed in the 17th century endured the founding of the nation. The Constitutional Compromise. When delegates gathered in 1787 to draft the United States Constitution, slavery stood at the center of debate. Southern states demanded protection for their labor system. Northern states wrestled with moral discomfort but feared disunion. The result was compromise. The 3/5 compromise counted enslaved individuals as 3/5 of a person for representation, not as citizens, not as voters, but as numerical political weight for slaveholding states. The Constitution also prohibited banning the transatlantic slave trade until 1808. And it included a fugitive slave clause requiring the return of escaped enslaved persons. These provisions did not invent slavery, they accommodated it. The legal architecture that began forming in 17th century Virginia, in cases like the 1655 ruling involving Anthony Johnson and the earlier 1640 differentiation in the case of John Punch, had matured into national framework. What began as colonial statute was now federal compromise. The expansion of cotton and the hardening of slavery. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 transformed the Southern economy. Cotton became king. Demand from British textile mills surged. The domestic slave trade expanded dramatically as enslaved people were sold from older tobacco regions like Virginia into the Deep South. The internal trade tore apart families. Auction blocks became central features of expanding plantation economies. The hereditary principle established in 1662 ensured that each generation replenished the labor force. By the early 19th century, slavery was no longer a regional anomaly. It was the backbone of Southern wealth and deeply intertwined with Northern finance and global markets. The early ambiguity of Anthony Johnson's era was unimaginable by this point. Race and bondage were inseparable in law. The moral risus emerges. As the 19th century progressed, abolitionist movements gained momentum. Formerly enslaved individuals published narratives exposing the brutality of plantation life. Religious revivals fueled moral opposition. Political parties fractured over expansion of slavery into new territories. Each new state admitted to the Union reignited conflict. Missouri, Kansas, Texas. The question was no longer whether slavery existed. It was whether it would spread. The contradiction between liberty and bondage intensified, and at the root of that contradiction lay the earlier legal decisions that transformed temporary servitude into permanent racial caste. Civil War. This stirs collapses. In 1861, the United States fractured. Southern states seceded to protect what they described as their economic and social order. Slavery. The Civil War was not simply a battle over territory. It was a reckoning with a system centuries in the making. When the 13th Amendment abolished slavery in 1865, it dismantled the legal structure of permanent bondage. But abolition did not erase the psychological and institutional residues of racial hierarchy. Reconstruction attempted transformation. Citizenship amendments expanded rights, but resistance was fierce. Jim Crow laws emerged. Segregation hardened. Economic exploitation adapted. The system evolved, but it did not disappear. The long shadow of origins. Anthony Johnson's life reveals something crucial. Slavery in America was not static from the beginning. It was built, adjusted, codified, hardened. There was a moment when Africans could complete service and own land. There was a moment when a black man could sue a white man and win. And then there was a moment when those possibilities vanished. Understanding that transition changes how we see American history. It was not inevitable. It was engineered. And engineering leaves traceable design. The unsettling legacy. Anthony Johnson is not easily categorized as hero or villain. He was a survivor navigating a volatile colonial world. He used the courts available to him. He sought security in land and labor. But he lived at the hinge point where fluid labor relations hardened into racial permanence. His life forces uncomfortable reflection. It reveals that systems evolve through incremental decisions. That categories can shift rapidly. That law can expand possibility and then retract it. The 17th century did not know it was building a racial caste system that would define America for centuries. But it did. And Anthony Johnson stands inside that transformation. After emancipation, Reconstruction, memory, and the strange afterlife of a 17th century Mar. The Maine. The Civil War ended in 1865 and the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. It dismantled a legal structure that had been under construction since the early colonial period. Through the 1662 Hereditary Statute, through the 1705 Slave Codes, through the constitutional compromises of 1787. It did not, however, erase the habits of hierarchy that those laws had normalized. The United States entered Reconstruction attempting something unprecedented, redefining citizenship in a nation that had legally categorized human beings as property for over 2 centuries. The 14th Amendment established birthright citizenship. The 15th Amendment prohibited racial discrimination in voting. For a brief period, Black Americans held public office across the South. Schools were built, communities mobilized, political participation expanded. But this moment of possibility was fragile. Resistance emerged quickly. Former Confederate states enacted black codes to restrict movement, labor contracts, and economic independence. White supremacist groups used intimidation to regain control. Federal enforcement waned in the 1870s. By the end of Reconstruction in 1877, Jim Crow segregation began hardening into its own legal regime. The structure had changed names, but hierarchy adapted, and this is where the long arc of Anthony Johnson's life becomes historically haunting, because his story reminds us that racial hierarchy in America was not static from the beginning. It was built, solidified, and then defended. Reconstruction tried to undo what colonial statutes had engineered. But undoing centuries of design is far more difficult than writing it. The strange historical irony. In the late 20th century, historians began revisiting early colonial records more systematically. As they traced the legal evolution of slavery, the 1655 lawsuit involving Anthony Johnson resurfaced as a key transitional moment. For some readers, the case created confusion. How could a black man have owned land and sued successfully in 1655, when racial slavery would later become so absolute? The answer lies in chronology. Johnson lived during a fluid phase. before racial identity had been fully hardened in the caste. His life proves that racial slavery in America was constructed step by step. It was not present in fully formed shape at the beginning, but that complexity has sometimes been misused. Certain commentators attempt to cite Johnson's lawsuit to suggest that slavery was not racial, or that Africans equally participated in its construction. That interpretation ignores the structural shift that followed. Johnson's case occurred in a narrow historical window. Within decades, laws would close that window permanently. Historical nuance matters. Johnson's lawsuit does not prove equality in early Virginia. It proves transition. And transition is not permanence. Historians view Judge. Modern scholarship treats Anthony Johnson as a transitional figure, neither hero nor villain, but a man navigating the unstable early decades of colonial America. His lawsuit did not create racial slavery. It reflected emerging legal reasoning around lifetime servitude that would later become racialized and codified. Historians emphasize three core points. First, early Virginia labor systems were more fluid than later periods. Second, economic pressures and political fear drove lawmakers toward racial permanence. Third, the legal hardening of race closed the opportunities that Johnson once accessed. He represents possibility before closure. He embodies the hinge, and hinges are historically significant, precisely because they mark movement. The Peace-White trilogy of memory. Why does Anthony Johnson's story feel unsettling? Because it resists simplicity. We prefer clear moral arcs, victim and oppressor, oppression and resistance, freedom and bondage. Johnson complicates those binaries. He was born into captivity, gained freedom, acquired land, asserted property rights, and lived long enough to see the system shifting toward rigid racial permanence. He did not design that shift, but he stood inside it. His life forces us to confront how systems evolve through ordinary decisions, court rulings, statutes, property disputes, not always through grand declarations, but through accumulation. And once accumulated, those decisions shape centuries. The modern echo. The importance of Anthony Johnson's story today lies not in assigning blame to a 17th century man, but in understanding institutional development. His life demonstrates that racial caste in America was not inevitable. It was engineered. And engineering can be studied. The legal distinction in 1655, the hereditary statute of 1662, the 1705 slave codes, the constitutional compromises of 1787, the enforcement of fugitive slave laws, the Civil War, the Reconstruction Amendments, the rollback into Jim Crow, the Civil Rights Movement. Each stage layered over the previous one. Johnson lived at the earliest layer. Understanding that layer clarifies the rest. Imagine the eastern shore of Virginia in the mid-1600s. Tobacco fields under a wide Atlantic sky. A small plantation operated by a man once captured in Angola. A court record written in careful script. A lawsuit argued. A judgment delivered. No one in that courtroom knew they were standing at the edge of structural transformation. Anthony Johnson likely believed he was securing his livelihood, but history was shifting beneath him. Within decades, the flexibility that enabled his rise would disappear. Race would harden into law. Generations would be born into bondage without exit. Johnson's story does not absolve the system. It illuminates its construction. He stands at the pivot between fluidity and fixation, between possibility and permanence, between early colonial improvisation and American racial caste. And that is why, centuries later, his name still matters. The fluid origins of racial slavery in colonial Virginia, the Archibald Foundation. What W.E. Satchable now? Let us begin not with myth, but with documents. The earliest known record of Anthony Johnson appears in the 1624/25 Virginia muster roll, where he is listed as Antonio, a Negro residing in the household of Edward Bennett on the eastern shore of Virginia. The designation a Negro is descriptive, not yet codified into permanent caste language. At this point, Virginia had no comprehensive slave code. The 1624 muster is crucial because it reveals something scholars emphasize. Africans in early Virginia were present within labor systems that had not yet fully crystallized into racialized hereditary slavery. Mortality in early Jamestown was extreme. In some years, over half the European settlers died. Surviving laborers, regardless of origin, became valuable. Antonio survived. By the 1640s, records indicate he had completed his term of service. He acquired land via the headright system, which granted acreage to individuals who financed transportation of laborers into the colony. Johnson himself secured approximately 250 acres.